A 75-year-old grandmother knelt crying in court, begging for her grandson's freedom. When she finally stood up, her words made even the judge wipe away tears. Dorothy Williams' hands trembled as she buttoned up her faded green church dress. The morning light crept through the thin curtains of her small Atlanta apartment, casting shadows on the water-stained walls. She glanced at the clock. 7:15 a.m. Still enough time before the service. "Grandma, you need help with those buttons?" Michael's voice carried from the kitchen, mixed with the smell of instant coffee. "I got it, baby." Her fingers fumbled with the last button. "You make sure you eat something before we go." Dorothy heard the familiar scrape of their only chair against the linoleum floor. At 75, her hearing wasn't what it used to be, but she could still pick out the sounds of her grandson's morning routine. The clink of a spoon against a bowl. The rustle of the newspaper they shared with the neighbors. The quiet that meant he was reading the job listings again. She stepped into the kitchen, her church shoes clicking against the floor. Michael sat hunched over a bowl of generic cornflakes, his work uniform draped over the chair back. The red delivery service logo was fading after countless washes. "You working after church today?" Dorothy asked, though she already knew the answer. Sunday doubles paid extra, and they needed every penny. Michael nodded, mouth full of cereal. He swallowed quickly. "Yeah, got a shift from 2 to 10. Should bring in enough to cover half the rent." Dorothy's hand instinctively went to her pocket, where she kept her medicine schedule. The paper was worn thin from constant folding and unfolding. 3 prescriptions due for refill, but the rent was due first. Always something due. "Mrs. Thompson called yesterday," Michael said, his voice careful. "Asked if we're coming to the church fundraiser next week." Dorothy sank into the chair across from him. Mrs. Thompson, the pastor's wife, had been helping them with groceries since Michael's parents died in the crash 3 years ago. The same crash that left Dorothy with nightmares and a grandson to raise on her own. "We'll be there," Dorothy said firmly. "Lord knows they've done enough for us." The morning light caught the silver in Michael's name tag as he stood to wash his bowl. 19 years old, but his shoulders carried the weight of a man twice his age, just like his father before him. "You sure you don't want me to skip church today?" he asked. "Could pick up an extra morning shift." "No, baby. Some things we don't skip. Your mama taught you that." The mention of his mother hung in the air between them. Dorothy watched as Michael's jaw tightened, then relaxed. He dried his hands on his jeans and checked his phone. "Bus should be here in 15 minutes, he said. Dorothy nodded, reaching for her worn Bible on the counter. The pages were dog-eared, marked with years of prayers and promises. She tucked it into her purse just as a knock echoed through the apartment. "Kind of early for visitors," Michael said, moving toward the door. Dorothy felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. The knock came again, harder this time. "Atlanta Police Department. Open up." Michael froze, his hand halfway to the doorknob. He turned to Dorothy, eyes wide with confusion and something else. "Fear." "Grandma?" Dorothy's legs felt weak. "Open it, baby. We got nothing to hide." The door swung open to reveal 2 officers, their badges catching the morning light. Behind them, Dorothy could see Mrs. Jenkins from across the hall, peering through her cracked door. "Michael Williams?" the taller officer asked, his hand resting on his belt. "Yes, sir?" Michael's voice cracked slightly. "We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with an armed robbery at the Quick Stop on Peachtree Street." Dorothy's purse hit the floor, her Bible spilling out. The sound seemed to come from very far away. "There must be some mistake," she heard herself say. "My grandson works delivery. He's never—" "Ma'am, we have security footage of the incident," the second officer cut in. "Please step back while we take him into custody." Dorothy watched, helpless, as they turned Michael around, the handcuffs clicking into place. His delivery uniform still hung on the kitchen chair, waiting for a shift he wouldn't make. "Grandma, call Pastor Thompson," Michael called over his shoulder as they led him away. "Tell him—" The door shut, cutting off his words. Through the thin walls, Dorothy could hear Mrs. Jenkins' door closing too, leaving her alone with the sound of her own ragged breathing. The morning light still streamed through the windows. The coffee maker still hummed on the counter. But Dorothy Williams stood in her Sunday best, staring at the closed door, feeling the world she'd carefully rebuilt crumbling around her once again. Her Bible lay open on the floor, pages bent. As she bent to pick it up, her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor beside it. The bus would be coming soon, ready to take them to church. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Dorothy Williams wouldn't be in her usual pew. Instead, she knelt on her kitchen floor, her Sunday dress collecting dust, and did the only thing she could do. She prayed. "Lord," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Lord, not again. Not my boy. Please, not my boy." Outside, a police siren wailed in the distance, growing fainter with each passing second, taking her grandson away from her, taking the last piece of her family she had left. Dorothy's fingers found her medicine schedule in her pocket, crumpling it as she clenched her fist. The rent was due in a week. Michael's delivery uniform hung like a ghost on the kitchen chair. And somewhere in the city, her grandson was being driven away in the back of a police car, accused of a crime she knew in her heart he couldn't have committed. The morning light continued to pour through the windows, indifferent to the way her world had just shattered. Dorothy Williams sat on her kitchen floor, surrounded by the scattered pages of her Bible, and felt the weight of time pressing down on her shoulders. The weight of years of loss, of struggle, of faith tested and tested again. And still, the day was only beginning. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dorothy sat in the detention center's waiting room. Her church dress was wrinkled now, the fabric carrying yesterday's dust from her kitchen floor. She'd been here since 6 in the morning, watching other families come and go while she waited for her 15-minute visit. "Mrs. Williams?" A guard called out, his voice echoing against the concrete walls. "You can see him now." Dorothy's joints cracked as she stood. The guard led her down a corridor lined with plastic chairs and glass partitions. The sound of her church shoes echoed with each step. Michael sat on the other side of the glass, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. Dark circles ringed his eyes. One night in jail, and her grandson already looked like a different person. Dorothy picked up the phone receiver with shaking hands. "Baby, you holding up?" "I'm okay, Grandma." Michael's voice crackled through the receiver. "They assigned me a lawyer. Public defender. That's good, right? That means they'll see you didn't do this." Michael's eyes dropped to the scratch counter in front of him. "He came by this morning, spent maybe 5 minutes with me. So they got security footage from the store." Dorothy leaned closer to the glass. "What security footage?" "You were working that night. I saw you leave in your uniform." "I know, Grandma. I told him that. But—" Michael's voice cracked. "He says the footage shows someone who looks like me. Says it'll be my word against the evidence." The receiver felt heavy in Dorothy's hand. "But what about your work records? Your delivery schedule? The lawyer? He says taking it to trial is risky. Says I should consider a plea deal." Dorothy's free hand gripped the counter edge. "A plea deal? For something you didn't do?" 6 years instead of 15, Michael whispered. That's what he said they'd offer. The fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting shadows across Michael's face. For a moment, Dorothy saw her son there, Michael's father, and the weight of loss pressed down on her chest. "No," she said firmly. "No plea deals. We're going to fight this." "Time's up," the guard called from behind her. Michael pressed his palm against the glass. Dorothy did the same, feeling the cold surface between them. "Pray for me, Grandma," he said before they took him away. Outside the detention center, the Atlanta sun beat down mercilessly. Dorothy's phone showed 3 missed calls from Mrs. Thompson. The church would be wondering where they were. But first, she had somewhere else to go. The quick stop on Peachtree Street looked smaller in daylight. Dorothy pushed through the door, setting off an electronic chime. Behind the counter, a young man looked up from his phone. "Can I help you?" "I need to see the security footage," Dorothy said. "From the robbery." The clerk's expression changed. "Police already took the footage, ma'am. Can't show it to anyone else." "My grandson." Dorothy's voice caught. "They're saying he did this. But he works delivery. He's a good boy. Look, lady, I just work here. You need to talk to the police or get a lawyer." The public defender's office was a 20-minute bus ride away. Dorothy sat on the hard plastic seat, watching the city blur past the window. Her medicine schedule crinkled in her pocket, still unopened, still unaffordable. The office smelled like old coffee and cheaper cleaning supplies. A receptionist pointed her to a cluttered desk where a young man in a rumpled suit was buried in paperwork. "Mr. Harris?" Dorothy asked. "I'm Michael Williams' grandmother." The lawyer looked up, blinking tired eyes. "Mrs. Williams the first was going to call you. About the plea deal dash, no." Dorothy cut him off. "No plea deals. I want to see the evidence they have against my grandson." Harris shuffled through some papers. "Mrs. Williams, the security footage is pretty clear. A young black male, Michael's height and build, wearing a dark hoodie dash. My grandson was working that night, delivering food. There must be records. The company's records show he clocked out an hour before the robbery." Dorothy's hands clenched in her lap. "Then there are delivery receipts, GPS records, something." Harris sighed, removing his glasses. "Mrs. Williams, you need to understand. The DA's office is offering a good deal here. 6 years with possibility of parole in 4. If we go to trial and lose dash, if you won't help us fight this." Dorothy stood up, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "Then we'll find someone who will." But finding another lawyer meant money they didn't have. Dorothy spent the afternoon calling law offices, each conversation ending the same way. Without a retainer, without thousands of dollars up front, no one would take the case. The sun was setting when she finally boarded the bus home. Her phone showed more missed calls. Mrs. Thompson, Pastor Thompson, church members wondering where they'd been. The community that had supported them for years. The community that might now turn its back on them. Her apartment felt emptier than ever. Michael's delivery uniform still hung on the chair, a reminder of the life that had been interrupted. Dorothy picked up her Bible from where it had fallen yesterday, smoothing its crumpled pages. The phone rang, startling her. An unknown number. "Mrs. Williams?" A man's voice. "This is District Attorney Richardson. I'm calling about your grandson's case." Dorothy's grip tightened on the phone. "Yes, I've reviewed the evidence. The plea deal we're offering is more than fair, given the circumstances. But it expires in 48 hours. My grandson is innocent." "Mrs. Williams." The DA's voice hardened slightly. "We have clear security footage. We have witnesses who can place him at the scene. Taking this to trial would be unwise." After he hung up, Dorothy sat in the growing darkness of her apartment. The medicine schedule in her pocket seemed to burn against her leg. 6 years. Her grandson would be 25 before he saw freedom again. If they took the deal. A text message lit up her phone. "Mrs. Thompson. Dorothy, we missed you at church. Is everything okay? The fundraiser committee needs to know if you're still helping next week." Dorothy stared at the message until the screen went dark. The church had been her anchor for decades. But now, with Michael accused, would they stand by them? Or would they slowly back away, not wanting to be associated with an accused robber's family? Sleep didn't come that night. Dorothy lay in bed, listening to the city sounds outside her window. Somewhere out there, Michael was trying to sleep on a jail cot, wearing prison orange instead of his delivery uniform. Somewhere, evidence that could prove his innocence might exist. But without money, without resources, without a lawyer who would actually fight for him, the clock ticked past midnight. Then 1, then 2. Dorothy's prayers filled the darkness. But for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure they were enough. When dawn finally broke, she hadn't slept at all. But she had made a decision. They wouldn't take the plea deal. They wouldn't give up. Whatever it took, however long it took, she would fight for her grandson's freedom. She just didn't know how. The local news van parked outside the courthouse caught Dorothy off guard. A reporter in a navy blazer stood before a camera, speaking into a microphone. Another case raising questions about racial profiling and rushed arrests in the Atlanta justice system. Michael Williams, 19, stands accused of armed robbery, though his family maintains his innocence. Dorothy clutched her purse tighter and hurried past them into the courthouse. The metal detector beeped as she walked through, and a security guard waved a wand over her trembling frame. "Arms out, ma'am." Her arthritis flared as she held the position. Behind her, she heard the reporter's voice drift in through the open door. "The case has drawn attention from local advocacy groups." The courtroom felt colder than it should for an Atlanta summer morning. Dorothy sat in the front row, empty seats on either side of her. A week ago, those seats would have been filled with church members. Now, only Mrs. Thompson had texted, "Praying for you both." The door opened, and Michael shuffled in, chains clinking around his ankles. The orange jumpsuit hung even looser now. 1 week in jail had already begun to wear him down. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The Honorable Judge Marcus presiding. Dorothy stood, her knees protesting. The judge, a white man with steel-gray hair, took his seat and peered down at the papers before him. Case number 2025 CR 1542, State of Georgia versus Michael Williams. How does the defendant plead? The public defender, Mr. Harris, stood. His suit looked even more rumpled than before. "Not guilty, Your Honor." "Very well. Is the state prepared to present its evidence?" The prosecutor, a sharp-faced woman in a crisp black suit, rose. "Yes, Your Honor. The state has security footage clearly showing the defendant committing armed robbery at the Quick Stop on Peachtree Street. We also have 2 witnesses who can identify the defendant as the perpetrator." Dorothy's heart pounded. 2 witnesses? They hadn't mentioned witnesses before. Additionally, the prosecutor continued, the defendant's work records show he had clocked out an hour before the robbery, giving him ample time to commit the crime. "Your Honor," Harris interjected, "my client was making food deliveries that night. We're still gathering evidence to prove his whereabouts." "Still gathering evidence?" The judge's eyebrows rose. "This case is set for trial in 3 weeks. How much more time do you need? The delivery company's records are complicated to access." The prosecutor smiled slightly. "The state is still willing to offer the plea deal we discussed. 6 years with possibility of parole in 4. But that offer expires at 5 p.m. today." Dorothy watched Michael's shoulders slump. Even from behind, she could read the defeat in his posture. "Take a 15-minute recess," Judge Marcus announced. "Use this time to seriously consider the state's offer, Mr. Williams." The chains clinked as Michael was led away. Dorothy tried to catch his eye, but he kept his head down. In the hallway, the reporter from earlier approached her. "Mrs. Williams?" "Jennifer Chen from Channel 11 News. Could we get a statement about your grandson's case?" Dorothy almost said no, but then she remembered the empty seats in the courtroom, the unanswered calls to potential lawyers, the community's silence. "My grandson is innocent," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "He was working that night, delivering food. But nobody wants to look for that evidence. Nobody wants to hear the truth. And what about the security footage? The witnesses? Show me these witnesses. Show me this footage. All I know is my grandson left home in his delivery uniform and came back in handcuffs." The interview aired on the evening news. Dorothy watched it from her apartment, the TV's glow filling the dark room. They'd cut most of what she'd said, leaving only, "My grandson is innocent." Her phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Jenkins across the hall. "Saw you on the news. Praying for you." Another buzz. "Pastor Thompson. Dorothy, perhaps we should discuss this situation privately." The subtext was clear. The church didn't want this attention. Didn't want to be associated with a crime story on the evening news. Dorothy's chest felt tight. Her medicine schedule sat unopened on the kitchen counter, along with a past-due notice from the pharmacy. The rent was due in 3 days. Michael's delivery uniform still hung on the chair, gathering dust. The next morning, more reporters waited outside the courthouse. The story had spread overnight. Local advocacy groups held signs, "Justice for Michael Williams" and "Stop rushing arrests." But inside the courtroom, nothing had changed. The prosecutor presented the security footage, grainy, black and white, showing someone in a dark hoodie whose face was barely visible. "As you can see, Your Honor," the prosecutor said, the build and height matched the defendant exactly. Dorothy squinted at the screen. The figure could have been anyone. Could have been any young black man in Atlanta. "The state calls its first witness," the prosecutor announced. James Martinez, assistant manager at Quick Stop. A young Hispanic man took the stand, nervously adjusting his tie. "Mr. Martinez, can you identify the person who robbed your store?" He pointed at Michael. "That's him. I'm sure of it." Objection. Harris finally showed some energy. "The witness couldn't possibly make a positive ID from that footage." "Your Honor, the prosecutor countered. Mr. Martinez was present during the robbery. Overruled. Dorothy watched Michael's head sink lower with each word. During the lunch recess, Harris pulled them into a conference room. The plea deal expires in 4 hours, he said, checking his watch. With this testimony, if we go to trial? No, Dorothy cut him off. My grandson is not pleading guilty to something he didn't do. Mrs. Williams, please. Be reasonable. The evidence dash. What evidence? A grainy video? A witness who claims he can identify someone he saw for maybe 2 minutes, weeks ago, but her words felt hollow against the weight of the system pressing down on them. The prosecutor had witnesses. They had nothing but Dorothy's faith in her grandson's innocence. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon sun slanted through the high windows. The second witness, a customer who'd been in the store, also identified Michael. Never mind that the robber had worn a hood. Never mind that it had been dark. At 4:30, the prosecutor approached their table. 30 minutes left on the plea deal. Tick-tock. Dorothy watched Michael conferring quietly with Harris. Watched her grandson's shoulders shake slightly. Watched the system grinding away at his hope, his future, his truth. The media attention hadn't helped. The advocacy groups hadn't helped. The community's prayers hadn't helped. They were alone in this courtroom, facing a machine that had already decided Michael's guilt. At 4:55, Harris stood. Your Honor, regarding the plea deal-no. Dorothy's voice echoed through the courtroom. Everyone turned to stare at her. Ma'am, the judge warned, outbursts will not be tolerated. But Dorothy was already on her feet. Her arthritis screamed as she moved forward. Her heart pounded in her chest. And somewhere deep inside, a lifetime of quiet dignity cracked open. My grandson is innocent, she said, her voice breaking. Please, someone has to listen. Someone has to help us find the truth. The bailiff moved toward her, but Dorothy barely noticed. Her knees gave way, and she found herself kneeling in the middle of the courtroom. Why are you doing this to my grandson? She asked, tears rolling down her cheeks. Why won't anyone help us? The courtroom fell silent except for her sobs. Even the judge seemed frozen, staring down at the elderly woman kneeling before his bench. The plea deal expired at 5 p.m. But Dorothy Williams remained on her knees, praying in a way she never had before. Not for mercy, not for comfort, for justice. The morning of the trial, Dorothy's hands shook so badly she couldn't button her dress. The same green dress she'd worn to church every Sunday for the past decade. The same dress she'd worn when they arrested Michael. The same dress she now wore to court, like armor against a system she no longer trusted. Need any help, Mrs. Williams? Mrs. Jenkins called through the apartment door. I'm fine, Dorothy called back, though she wasn't. Nothing had been fine since that morning 3 weeks ago. The courthouse steps seemed steeper today. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray Atlanta sky. A reporter shoved a microphone in her face. Mrs. Williams, how do you feel about today's trial? Dorothy pushed past without answering. Her joints ached from the dampness in the air, from the stress, from the weight of everything bearing down on her shoulders. Inside the courtroom, she noticed the changes immediately. The gallery was full now. Local activists, reporters, curious onlookers, all here to watch her grandson's fate decided by 12 strangers who'd never met him. Michael was already there, seated beside Mr. Harris. The orange jumpsuit hung loose around his neck. 3 weeks of jail food had hollowed his cheeks. All rise. Judge Marcus entered, his robes swishing as he took his seat. He looked tired, like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. First day of trial for case number 2025, CR 1542, he announced. Is the prosecution ready to proceed? The prosecutor stood, smoothing her blazer. Yes, Your Honor. The state calls its first witness, James Martinez. Dorothy watched the quick-stop assistant manager take the stand again. He looked different today, more confident, like he'd rehearsed his story until it's shown. Mr. Martinez, the prosecutor began, please tell us what happened the night of June 15th. I was closing up the store, Martinez said. Around 10:30 p.m. This guy comes in wearing a dark hoodie, pulls out a gun, demands the money from the register, And is that man in the courtroom today? Martinez pointed at Michael. That's him. Right there. Dorothy's hands clenched in her lap. Michael had been delivering food at 10:30. She remembered him coming home later, complaining about a bad tip from his last delivery. Harris stood for cross-examination, shuffling his papers. Mr. Martinez, how can you be so sure it was my client? The robber wore a hood. I saw his face when he turned to leave. I'm positive it's him. In a dark store? At 10:30 at night? Through a hood? Objection. The prosecutor stood. Asked and answered. Sustained. Harris sat down, already looking defeated. Dorothy felt something crack inside her chest. The next witness was worse. A customer who claimed she'd seen Michael hanging around the store earlier that day. But Michael had been sleeping then, exhausted from his late shift the night before. Dorothy remembered, because she'd had to wake him for his evening deliveries. The state calls Detective Sarah Rodriguez, the prosecutor announced. A sharp-faced woman in a police uniform took the stand. She spoke about the investigation, about the security footage, about how quickly they'd identified Michael as a suspect. And what led you to Mr. Williams? The prosecutor asked. The build matched. The height matched. And we found out he lived in the area, had financial troubles. Dorothy wanted to scream. Having financial troubles didn't make someone a criminal. Being young and black and living nearby didn't make someone guilty. The security footage played again on the courtroom screen. The same grainy images, the same hooded figure. Dorothy could barely make out any features, but somehow everyone else seemed so certain it was her grandson. If you look here, Detective Rodriguez pointed, you can see the suspect's distinctive gait. It matches Mr. Williams exactly. Harris barely objected anymore. He sat slumped in his chair, occasionally scribbling notes he never used. During the lunch break, Dorothy overheard two reporters in the bathroom. Pretty open and shut case, one said. Don't know why they didn't take the plea deal. The grandmother's in denial. You see these cases all the time. Dorothy's hands shook as she washed them. The soap dispenser was empty, just like her hope was running dry. Back in the courtroom, the prosecution presented their final piece of evidence, Michael's work records. As you can see, the prosecutor pointed to a timeline on a screen. Mr. Williams clocked out at 9:30 p.m. The robbery occurred at 10:30 p.m. Plenty of time for him to change clothes and commit the crime. Dorothy knew why he clocked out early. The delivery app had been glitching. He'd had to restart his phone to fix it. She'd heard him complaining about it that night. The state rests, Your Honor. Judge Marcus turned to Harris. Defense, call your first witness. Harris stood slowly. Your Honor, the defense calls Michael Williams to the stand. Dorothy's heart stopped. They hadn't prepared for this. Harris had barely spoken to Michael since the arrest. Michael walked to the stand, chains clinking with each step. He raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, sat down under the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Mr. Williams, Harris began, where were you at 10:30 p.m. on June 15th? Delivering food, Michael said. His voice sounded small in the large room. I had orders all night. Can you prove that? The app, it was having problems that night. I had to clock out and restart it. So you have no proof of your deliveries after 9:30 p.m.? Michael's eyes dropped. No, sir, the prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. Mr. Williams, why did you really clock out early that night? I told you, the app Dash. Isn't it true you needed money for your grandmother's medications? Michael's face fell. Yes, but Dash, isn't it true you were desperate? Objection. Harris finally showed some fire. Argumentative. Sustained. But the damage was done. Dorothy saw it in the jury's faces. They'd made up their minds. Her grandson was just another young black man who'd chosen crime over honest work. They couldn't see the Michael who worked double shifts to pay her rent, who read her Bible verses when her eyes were too tired, who'd never given up on her, even when the world had given up on them. The prosecutor's closing argument was a masterpiece of prejudice dressed in legal language. She talked about evidence and certainty, about protecting society, about making hard choices. Harris's closing barely deserved the name. He mumbled about reasonable doubt, about rushed investigations, about the possibility of mistakes. The jury will now retire to deliberate, Judge Marcus announced. Court is in recess. Dorothy watched Michael being led away. He looked back at her once, his eyes full of fear and something worse, resignation. Like he'd already accepted what was coming. The courtroom emptied slowly. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Activists whispered among themselves. But Dorothy stayed in her seat, her hands clasped in her lap, praying harder than she ever had before. An hour passed. Then two. The sun shifted in the windows, casting long shadows across the empty benches. When the bailiff announced the jury was returning, Dorothy felt her world narrow to a single point. This moment, this decision, this last chance at justice. They filed in, none of them looking at Michael. Dorothy knew that look, had seen it too many times in her 75 years. As the jury reached a verdict, the foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." Dorothy's legs moved before her mind could catch up. She found herself walking forward, past the barrier, into the space before the judge's bench. "Mrs. Williams," Judge Marcus warned, "return to your seat." But Dorothy couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't watch them take her grandson away. Her knees gave out, and she fell to the floor. The cold marble pressed against her legs through her church dress. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Please listen. My grandson is innocent. He's all I have left. Please." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Cameras clicked. The judge banged his gavel. "Order! Mrs. Williams, you must dash. Why are they doing this to my grandson?" Her voice rose, filled with decades of pain and loss and injustice. "Why won't anyone help us find the truth?" She felt hands trying to help her up, but she stayed on her knees. Tears ran down her face, dropping onto the marble floor. "He's a good boy," she sobbed. "He works so hard. He takes care of me. Please, please don't take him away." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Dorothy Williams, 75 years old, knelt before justice and begged for mercy. For truth. For someone, anyone, to really look at her grandson and see him as she did. And in that silence, something changed. She couldn't see it yet, couldn't know it yet, but her cry had been heard. Not by the system that had already judged her grandson, but by someone else. Someone who would help them find the truth. But for now, Dorothy Williams stayed on her knees, her tears falling on the marble floor of justice, waiting for a verdict that would either save or destroy what remained of her family. The video spread like wildfire. Dorothy saw herself on every news channel, an elderly black woman on her knees in court, begging for her grandson's freedom. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from reporters, but she let them all go to voicemail. "You're trending on Twitter," Mrs. Jenkins said through the apartment wall. "My daughter showed me. People are sharing your story everywhere." Dorothy sat at her kitchen table, staring at Michael's empty chair. The delivery uniform still hung there, gathering more dust. The rent was overdue now. Her medicine schedule remained unopened. A knock at the door made her jump. She opened it to find Jennifer Chun from Channel 11 News. "Mrs. Williams, please. Just 5 minutes. I've said everything I need to say," Dorothy replied, starting to close the door. "Wait." Jennifer stuck her foot in the doorway. "There's something you should know. After your video went viral, we've been getting calls. People asking questions about the investigation." Dorothy's hand froze on the door. "What kind of questions?" "About the quick stop. About the witnesses. Some things don't add up." Before Dorothy could respond, her phone rang. Pastor Thompson's number. "I should take this," she said, closing the door on Jennifer's protests. "Dorothy," Pastor Thompson's voice was heavy. "The church board met this morning." She sank into her chair. "And some members are concerned about the attention, about how this reflects on our congregation. My grandson is innocent. I know you believe that, but perhaps it would be best if you took a break from church activities. Just until this situation resolves." The line went dead. Dorothy stared at her phone, feeling another piece of her world crack away. At the courthouse the next morning, the crowd had doubled. Signs waved above the steps, "Justice for Michael Williams," mixed with others she couldn't bear to read. Inside, Judge Marcus looked even more tired. "Given recent events and the media attention this case has attracted, we'll take a brief recess. Court will reconvene Monday morning." In the hallway, Dorothy overheard the prosecutor arguing with Detective Rodriguez. "The delivery app records," the detective said, They're more complicated than we thought. We have witnesses. We have the footage. Don't let this media circus distract you. Dorothy's heart jumped. The delivery records. Maybe there was still hope. But when she tried to talk to Harris about it, he barely looked up from his phone. The prosecution's case is solid. You should be thinking about an appeal strategy. An appeal? They haven't even finished the trial. Harris finally met her eyes. Mrs. Williams, that video, it won't help Michael. If anything, it makes us look desperate. We are desperate. Back home, more messages waited. Church members expressing their concern. Old friends suddenly too busy to talk. Even Mrs. Jenkins seemed to take longer to answer her door. Dorothy's TV showed endless replays of her breakdown in court. Commentators debated what it meant. Some called it a powerful moment of truth. Others called it a manipulation tactic. The grandmother's emotional display raises questions. One analyst said, "Is this genuine desperation or a calculated attempt to influence the juries?" Dorothy turned off the TV. Her hands shook as she tried to make tea, the cup rattling against the saucer. Another knock at the door. This time a different reporter. "Mrs. Williams, we've been investigating the Quick Stop robbery. There's something you should see." He held up his phone, showing her a document. Work schedules from the store. James Martinez, the witness who identified Michael? He wasn't even supposed to be working that night. Dorothy's tea grew cold on the counter as she listened. The reporter had more discrepancies in statements, questions about the timing. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because someone needs to look closer at this case." Really look? But looking closer meant money they didn't have, lawyers they couldn't afford, resources that seemed forever out of reach. The weekend dragged by. Dorothy's phone kept ringing. Reporters, activists, strangers who'd seen her video. She answered none of them. Sunday morning felt strange without church. She put on her green dress anyway, sat in her kitchen, and read her Bible alone. Mrs. Thompson texted, "The prayer circle misses you." Dorothy typed back, "Do they miss me? Or do they miss who I was before all this?" No response. Monday morning brought new chaos. The courthouse steps were packed with protesters on both sides. Signs waved. "Free Michael Williams" competed with "Support our police." Inside, Dorothy noticed something different. The jury wouldn't look at her, wouldn't look at Michael. Their faces showed strain, like people carrying a weight they hadn't expected. "Your Honor," the prosecutor began, "despite the recent publicity, the state's evidence remains clear." But for the first time, her voice held a note of uncertainty. Detective Rodriguez took the stand again, this time under defense cross-examination. Harris seemed different today, more focused, almost energized. "Detective, did you verify Mr. Martinez's work schedule for the night in question?" "We had his statement dash. That's not what I asked." "Did you verify his schedule?" The detective shifted in her seat. The store's records were unclear. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Dorothy sat straighter in her bench. "And the customer who identified my client? Did you check security footage to confirm she was actually in the store that day?" "Objection." The prosecutor stood, asked and answered in previous testimony. "No, Your Honor," Harris countered. "This is new evidence that's come to light." Judge Marcus leaned forward. "I'll allow it." The detective's discomfort grew visible. "We may have been too quick to accept the witness statements." The prosecutor's face tightened. She whispered urgently with her team during the lunch break, papers shuffling between them. In the hallway, Dorothy overheard snippets of conversation between reporters. Delivery app records might show. Witness credibility issues. Rushed investigation. But hope was a dangerous thing. She'd seen too many moments of possibility fade away. The afternoon brought more questioning. More cracks in the prosecution's case. More signs that perhaps, just perhaps, someone was finally looking closer. But Michael still sat in his orange jumpsuit. Still wore chains. Still faced years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Dorothy's knees ached from the hard benches, but she wouldn't move. Wouldn't look away. Wouldn't give up. The day ended with more questions than answers. As guards led Michael away, he looked back at her. For the first time in weeks, she saw something in his eyes besides resignation. Outside, the media circus continued. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Dorothy pushed through them all, clutching her purse like a shield. At home, she found another notice on her door. Final warning for the rent. Below it, a note from Mrs. Jenkins. Dorothy, my daughter found something online about the Quick Stop robbery. Call me. She stared at the notes, her vision blurring. The system that had seemed so certain of Michael's guilt was showing cracks. But would those cracks be enough? Would anyone look through them to find the truth? Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. Another reporter wanting a statement. Another activist offering support. Dorothy let it ring. She sat in her kitchen, in the growing darkness, and did what she'd done every night since this began. She prayed. Not for mercy anymore. Not even for justice. For truth. For someone to see it. For someone to help them find it. Outside, the city hummed with activity. News vans parked on her street. Social media buzzed with her story. The video of her breakdown played on endless loop. But inside her apartment, Dorothy Williams sat alone, caught between hope and fear, between faith and doubt, between the system's shadow and the first faint glimmers of dawn. The chest pain started around midnight. Dorothy sat up in bed, pressing her hand against her heart, feeling it race beneath her nightgown. The room spun slightly. Lord, she whispered, not now. Please, not now. She fumbled for her phone, but her fingers wouldn't work right. The screen blurred. Her breath came in short gasps. A thump against the wall. Mrs. Jenkins' voice. Dorothy? You all right? I heard something fall. Dorothy tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. The next thing she knew, paramedics were lifting her onto a stretcher. Mrs. Jenkins stood in the doorway, still in her nightgown. I'm calling everyone, Mrs. Jenkins said. The church, the lawyer, the news people. Someone has to help. The emergency room lights hurt Dorothy's eyes. A doctor in blue scrubs checked her vital signs, asked questions she could barely focus on. Stress-induced cardiac event, she heard him say. Need to monitor? Dorothy tried to sit up. My grandson, the trial? Mrs. Williams, you need to rest. Your blood pressure is dangerously high. But rest wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Michael in his orange jumpsuit, saw the jury's averted gazes, saw the prosecution's smug certainty. Morning brought more bad news. Harris called her hospital room. Mrs. Williams, the judge won't delay the trial. Says there's been too much postponement already. Dorothy's heart monitor beeped faster. But I need to be there. I'll do my best to represent Michael's interests. Your best? Dorothy's voice cracked. Like you did before? Pushing that plea deal. Harris sighed. I know you're upset, but dash upset? My grandson is facing prison for something he didn't do, and I'm stuck in this hospital bed. Upset doesn't begin to cover it. She hung up before he could respond. The nurse came in to check her vitals, frowning at the numbers on the monitor. You need to stay calm, Mrs. Williams' doctor's orders. But calm wouldn't come. Not when her phone kept lighting up with updates from Mrs. Jenkins, who'd gone to the courthouse. Dorothy, the church people still aren't here. The prosecution's bringing more witnesses. Michael keeps looking for you. Around noon, Jennifer Chun from Channel 11 somehow got through to her room. Mrs. Williams, we've found something. About the Quick Stop robbery. There was another incident, 2 weeks before, same MO. But Michael was working that night. We have proof. Dorothy's hands shook as she held the phone. Have you told Mr. Harris? Been trying. He won't call back. The heart monitor beeped faster. A nurse stuck her head in, frowning. Mrs. Williams, you need to rest. But rest was impossible. Not when her grandson's future was being decided without her. Not when evidence that could save him was being ignored. She waited until the nurses changed shifts. Pulled out her four with trembling fingers. Found her clothes in the closet. The hospital corridors seemed endless. Every step made her chest hurt worse. But Dorothy Williams had not come this far to give up now. She made it to the lobby before someone noticed. An orderly called out, started after her. But Dorothy was already through the doors, out in the bright Atlanta sun. The courthouse was 15 blocks away. She had $3 in her purse, just enough for the bus. Her phone buzzed constantly. The nurse discovering her gone. Mrs. Jenkins updating her on the trial. Jennifer Chun trying to tell her more about the evidence. Dorothy's chest felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. Each breath hurt more than the last. But she kept going. The bus driver gave her a concerned look. "Ma'am, you all right? You're awful pale." "I'm fine," she lied. "Just need to get to the courthouse." She could see the news vans from 2 blocks away. The crowd on the steps had grown. Signs waved in the air. Justice for Michael competed with law and order. Dorothy's legs shook as she climbed the courthouse steps. The world swam at the edges of her vision. But she kept going. Inside, she heard the prosecutor's voice echoing from the courtroom. "The state calls its final witness." The bailiff tried to stop her. "Ma'am, you can't dash," but Dorothy pushed past him, pushed through the heavy doors, felt every eye in the room turn to her. Michael half rose from his chair. "Grandma," she saw his face, saw the fear in his eyes, saw the chains on his wrists, and something inside Dorothy Williams, something that had bent and bent and bent, finally broke. "Stop!" Her voice rang through the courtroom. "Stop this right now." "Mrs. Williams." Judge Marcus banged his gavel. "You are in contempt, no." Dorothy staggered forward. "You're in contempt. All of you. Sitting here pretending this is justice." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, there's evidence." Dorothy's voice cracked. "Evidence you're ignoring. Another robbery, same store, when Michael was working. Jennifer Chun from Channel 11 found it." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge banged his gavel again. "Order! I will have order!" But Dorothy's legs were giving out. The pain in her chest was unbearable now. The world was going gray at the edges. "My grandson is innocent," she gasped. Someone has to." The floor rushed up to meet her. She heard Michael calling her name, heard chaos erupting in the courtroom. Then everything went black. She woke to beeping machines and white walls. Different hospital room, different monitors, same pain in her chest. Mrs. Jenkins sat beside her bed, holding her hand. "You scared us half to death, Dorothy." "Michael." Her voice was barely a whisper. "The trial, they had to stop. After you collapsed." Well, someone finally started asking the right questions. Dorothy tried to focus. What questions? About that other robbery. About the witnesses. About why nobody looked harder at the evidence before charging Michael. Is he still in custody? But Dorothy, Mrs. Jenkins squeezed her hand. "Something's changed. That lawyer who's been trying to reach you? The one from the news? She's not the only one asking questions now." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't let them take him." "Sure." Mrs. Jenkins wiped her cheeks. "You rest now. Let others fight for a while." But Dorothy Williams had never been good at letting others fight her battles. Even as exhaustion pulled her back towards sleep, her mind worked. She'd broken down in court twice now, brought shame to her church, lost friends, nearly lost her life. But maybe that's what it took. Maybe sometimes faith had to break before truth could shine through. Her chest still hurt. Her heart still raced. But for the first time in weeks, Dorothy felt something else. Hope. Small. Fragile. But there. Someone was finally asking the right questions. Someone was finally looking for the truth. Dorothy Williams closed her eyes, let the monitors beep their steady rhythm, and prayed one more time. Not for mercy. Not for justice. Not even for truth. For strength. To see this through. To hold on until the truth came out. To keep fighting, even when faith broke. Because sometimes she was learning that's when miracles happened. When faith broke, and something stronger took its place. The will to stand up. To speak out. To fight on. Even if it killed her. Because Michael was innocent. And finally, someone else might be ready to believe it too. The woman who walked into Dorothy's hospital room didn't look like salvation. She wore jeans and a wrinkled blazer, carried a beaten-up leather briefcase, and had dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept in days. "Mrs. Williams?" She stuck out her hand. "I'm Sarah Martinez. I was in court when you collapsed." Dorothy tried to sit up straighter in her hospital bed. "You're a reporter?" "Defense attorney. I specialize in wrongful convictions." Sarah pulled up a chair. "And something about your grandson's case doesn't add up." Dorothy's heart monitor beeped faster. "Mr. Harris said dash. Mr. Harris is handling 30 other cases. He barely had time to read the prosecution's evidence, let alone look for new leads." Sarah opened her briefcase. But I've been doing some digging. She spread papers across Dorothy's blanket. Police reports, store records, delivery app screenshots. The quick stop was robbed twice in 3 weeks. Same method, same description. But the police only focused on the second robbery. Dorothy's hands shook as she touched the papers. Michael was working during the first one, according to the delivery app records, yes. Making deliveries all night, which means either he has a twin brother nobody knows about, or he didn't do either robbery. Dorothy finished. Sarah nodded. Exactly. But that's just the start. The witness statements? Full of inconsistencies. The security footage? Too grainy for a positive ID. And Mr. Martinez, the store manager who identified Michael? His work schedule shows he wasn't even supposed to be there that night. Dorothy's chest tightened, but not from pain this time. From hope. Dangerous, fragile hope. Can you help us? Sarah ran a hand through her hair. If you'll let me. But Mrs. Williams, I need to be clear. This won't be easy. The DA's office doesn't like admitting mistakes. And they've already invested a lot in prosecuting Michael. Nothing about this has been easy. A nurse stuck her head in. Mrs. Williams needs rest. 5 more minutes, Dorothy said firmly. To Sarah, she added, tell me what you need. Everything. Every detail about Michael's routine. His delivery schedule. His regular customers. Anything that might help prove where he was that night. Dorothy's mind raced. He keeps all his delivery receipts. For taxes. They're in a shoebox under his bed. I'll need them. And Mrs. Williams? Sarah's eyes were intense. That collapse in court? The questions you raised about the other robbery? It got people's attention. A local civil rights group has offered to help with expenses. For the first time in weeks, Dorothy felt tears that weren't from pain or fear. When can you start? I already have. Sarah gathered her papers. Rest now. Let me handle the next steps. But rest wouldn't come. As soon as Sarah left, Dorothy asked for her phone. First call, Mrs. Jenkins. I need you to get something from my apartment. Second call, Jennifer Chun at Channel 11. That evidence you found? I need everything. Third call, Pastor Thompson's voicemail. I know the church has turned its back, but God hasn't, and neither will I. Her hands shook as she hung up. The nurse came in to check her vitals, frowning at the numbers. Your blood pressure's up again. Getting justice will help more than any medicine. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Sarah came and went bringing updates. Mrs. Jenkins brought Michael's delivery records. Jennifer Chin shared her investigation notes. Dorothy watched from her hospital bed as the pieces started coming together. The first robbery, Sarah explained, sprinting out a timeline. The description matches the second one exactly. Same height, same build, same hoodie. But Michael was making deliveries across town. Can we prove it? Delivery app, GPS records, customer signatures, even a selfie one customer took with him when he delivered their order. Hope. Dangerous, wonderful hope. But the prosecution fought back. They called the similarities between the robberies circumstantial, questioned the reliability of delivery app records, insisted their witnesses were credible. They're scared, Sarah said. They rushed to judgment, ignored evidence, and now they're trying to cover their tracks. Dorothy's strength returned slowly. The doctors wanted her to stay in the hospital, but she had other plans. Mrs. Williams, her doctor warned, your heart dash, my heart won't heal until my grandson is free. She signed herself out against medical advice. Sarah was waiting with her car. You sure about this? Dorothy straightened her church dress. Take me to see my grandson. The detention center looked different now. Less imposing. Or maybe Dorothy was different. Michael's face lit up when he saw her. Grandma, they said you were in the hospital. Can't keep me down, baby. She pressed her hand against the glass. And we're going to make sure they can't keep you down either. She told him about Sarah, about the evidence, about the hope. For the first time since his arrest, Michael smiled. Really smiled. I knew you wouldn't give up on me, Grandma. Never. Her voice was fierce. We've got people helping now. Real help. Back at her apartment, Dorothy found more allies waiting. Mrs. Jenkins had organized neighbors to help sort through Michael's records. Jennifer Chun brought her research team. Sarah set up a makeshift command center on Dorothy's kitchen table. The delivery app company finally sent the complete records, Sarah announced. GPS tracking shows every stop Michael made that night. Dorothy's hands shook as she looked at the map. Little dots showing her grandson's path across Atlanta. Proof of his innocence, hidden in plain sight. But why didn't the police check this before? Mrs. Jenkins asked. Because they thought they had their man. Sarah's voice was hard. Young black male, financial troubles, lived in the area. They stopped looking as soon as they found Michael. Dorothy's chest tightened, but she pushed through it. No time for weakness now. They worked through the night. Delivery records. Witness statements. Timeline inconsistencies. Around midnight, Jennifer Chun burst in. We found something. The first robbery? The one they ignored? There's surveillance footage from a building across the street. Shows the suspect's car. Sarah grabbed the footage. A blue sedan. Michael doesn't have a car. He takes the bus to his deliveries, Dorothy confirmed. Always has. Hope built on hope. Evidence on evidence. But Dorothy knew hope wasn't enough. Evidence wasn't enough. They needed something more. The witnesses, she said suddenly. The ones who identified Michael. Have you talked to them? Sarah shook her head. They won't return my calls. Then I'll talk to them. Mrs. Williams, you can't watch me. She was tired of waiting. Tired of letting others fight her battles. Tired of being helpless. The next morning, Dorothy Williams put on her church dress, picked up her Bible, and went to find the truth. First stop, quick stop. James Martinez was stocking shelves. Mrs. Williams. He started to back away. I'm not here to threaten you. She sat on a milk crate, ignoring her protesting joints. I'm here to ask why. Why what? Why you said you saw my grandson that night, when your work schedule shows you weren't even here. Martinez's face fell. They said they were sure it was him. Said my testimony would help put a dangerous criminal away. My grandson delivers food to pay my rent, to buy my medicine. Does that sound dangerous to you? She saw the moment his certainty cracked. I might have been too quick to say I was sure. One witness down. One step closer to truth. Dorothy Williams left Quick Stop with something better than hope. She had purpose. The fight wasn't over. The system wouldn't admit its mistakes easily. But Dorothy wasn't kneeling anymore. She was standing. And this time, she wasn't standing alone. The courtroom felt different this time. Dorothy sat straight in her bench, Sarah Martinez beside her, watching the prosecution scramble with their papers. The smug certainty was gone from their faces. Your Honor, Sarah stood, her voice steady. The defense moves to present new evidence in the case of State versus Michael Williams. Judge Marcus looked tired. These last weeks had aged him. Proceed, counselor. Sarah nodded to her assistant, who wheeled in a TV screen. First, surveillance footage from the Thompson building, directly across from Quick Stop. This is from the first robbery, 2 weeks before the one my client is accused of. The footage played. Grainy, but clear enough to show a blue sedan pulling up to the store. A figure in a dark hoodie getting out. Note the vehicle, Sarah continued. Now, evidence will show that my client, Michael Williams, does not own a car. Has never owned a car. Takes the bus to his delivery job. The prosecutor stood. Objection, Your Honor. This is from a different incident which the police failed to properly investigate. Sarah cut in. Despite the identical method, identical description, identical everything. They stopped looking as soon as they found Michael Williams. Dorothy watched the jury. Saw them leaning forward. Saw doubt crossing their faces. Furthermore, Sarah continued, we have complete GPS records from the delivery app showing Michael's exact location during both robberies. She pulled up a map on the screen. Little blue dots tracking across Atlanta. The night of the first robbery, Michael made 17 deliveries, including one to Mrs. Patricia Chun at 10:27 p.m., exactly when the first robbery occurred. Mrs. Chun stood up in the gallery. That's right. He delivered my pad thai. Even took a selfie with me when I asked. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Marcus banged his gavel. Order. But the momentum had shifted. Dorothy could feel it in the air. Sarah wasn't done. We also have a signed affidavit from James Martinez, the Quick Stop assistant manager who previously identified Michael as the robber. Martinez himself stood up from the gallery. The prosecutor's face went pale. Mr. Martinez? Sarah prompted. He cleared his throat. I wasn't actually working that night. I wasn't supposed to be there. The police, they showed me a photo of Michael, said they were sure he did it. I just went along with what they wanted. More murmurs. More gavel bangs. Your Honor, the prosecutor tried to regain control. This is highly irregular dash. What's irregular? Sarah's voice cut through the room. Is how quickly the police decided my client was guilty. How they ignored evidence that didn't fit their narrative. How they pressured witnesses to confirm what they'd already decided. Dorothy watched Michael at the defense table. His shoulders were straight now, his eyes clear. But perhaps most irregular, Sarah continued, is this? She played another video. Security footage from a gas station. This is from last night. 3 miles from Quick Stop. Notice anything familiar? The same blue sedan. The same hooded figure. The same method. My client was in custody when this happened. So either he's mastered the art of being in 2 places at once. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Even Judge Marcus's mouth twitched. The prosecutor stood again. Your Honor, this is all circumstantial dash, like the evidence against my client. Sarah's voice was steel. Let's talk about circumstantial. Let's talk about how a 19-year-old boy with no criminal record, working 2 jobs to support his grandmother, became your prime suspect. Let's talk about why you ignored the first robbery. Let's talk about why you pressured witnesses to identify someone they'd never seen. Dorothy's heart raced, but not from fear this time. From justice. From truth. The defense calls Detective Sarah Rodriguez back to the stand. The detective looks smaller now, less certain. Detective, Sarah began, when did you first become aware of the previous robbery at Quick Stop? We were focused on the second incident. Why? Same method, same description, same everything. Why ignore it? Rodriguez shifted in her seat. We had a suspect dash. You had a convenience suspect. Young, black, living nearby. Did you even look at his work records? The delivery app data was complicated to access. Complicated? Sarah held up a phone. I got it with 1 email. Almost like you didn't want to find evidence that didn't fit your theory. The detective's face flushed. The prosecutor's objection died in her throat. Dorothy watched truth spreading through the courtroom like sunlight. Watched the jury's faces changing. Watched justice finally awakening. Sarah wasn't done. Your Honor, I called Barbara Chin from Channel 11 News. Jennifer Chin's colleague took the stand, holding up a file. Ms. Chin, what did your investigation reveal about the Quick Stop robberies? We found a pattern. Similar robberies across Atlanta. All involving a blue sedan. All targeting small stores. All occurring when the security cameras were known to be grainy or malfunctioning. The prosecutor slumped in her chair. Dorothy saw the moment she knew it was over. And Mrs. Williams, Sarah turned to the gallery. Would you say your grandson owns a blue sedan? Dorothy stood. All eyes turned to her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. My grandson takes the bus to work, she said clearly. Takes the bus to make his deliveries. Takes the bus to bring me my medicine when he can afford it. He's never owned a car in his life. The truth rang through the courtroom like a bell. Sarah turned to Judge Marcus. Your Honor, in light of this evidence, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges. The prosecutor stood one last time, opened her mouth, closed it. The state, she said finally, withdraws the charges against Michael Williams. The courtroom erupted. Dorothy felt Mrs. Jenkins hugging her. Her people cheering. Saw Michael standing, chains being removed. But all she could focus on was his face. The tears running down his cheeks. The smile breaking through like sunrise. Order! Judge Marcus banged his gavel. Order in the court. When quiet finally fell, he looked down at Michael. Mr. Williams, the charges against you are dismissed. You are free to go. And he paused, removed his glasses. The court offers its sincere apology for this miscarriage of justice. Michael turned to Dorothy. She opened her arms and finally, her grandson was free to walk into them. The system had bent. The truth had come out. Justice had awakened. But Dorothy Williams knew their fight wasn't over. Somewhere out there, the real robber was still free. Other innocent people were still trapped in the system's shadow. She held her grandson tight, feeling his tears soaking her church dress. They had won this battle. But the war for justice? That was just beginning. The morning after Michael's release, Dorothy woke to the smell of coffee. Real coffee, not the instant kind they usually bought. She found Michael in the kitchen, still in his delivery uniform, unpacking grocery bags. Been up since 4, he said, putting away fresh vegetables. Had to make up for lost deliveries. Dorothy's throat tightened. 3 weeks in jail, and her grandson's first thought was getting back to work. Back to taking care of her. Got your medicine too, he added, placing the orange bottles on the counter. The good pharmacy filled them, even though we're behind on payments. Said they saw us on the news. The news. Dorothy hadn't turned on the TV since yesterday's verdict. Hadn't wanted to see herself, Michael. Their story played over and over. But she couldn't avoid it forever. The phone started ringing at 7. Dorothy? Pastor Thompson's voice. The church board met this morning. Save it, she cut him off. We found another church. One that stands by its people in hard times. Next call, Jennifer Chun. Mrs. Williams, we'd like to do a follow-up story about what happens after wrongful arrests, how families put their lives back together. Dorothy watched Michael making breakfast, moving easily around their small kitchen. Maybe later. Right now, we need time, but time, it seemed, had other plans. By noon, more reporters gathered outside their building. Civil rights activists, community organizers, all wanted to talk about Michael's case, about the system, about change. We don't have to talk to them, Michael said, washing breakfast dishes. We can just live our life. Dorothy looked at her grandson, really looked at him, saw the weight he'd lost in jail, the new hardness in his eyes. The way he checked the locks twice now, jumped at sudden noises. No, she said finally. We have to talk, have to tell our story. Because somewhere out there, another grandmother is watching her grandson get arrested for something he didn't do. Sarah Martinez arrived around 2, carrying more files. Police caught the real robber, she announced, spreading papers on their kitchen table. That gas station footage did it. Blue sedan led them right to him. He's confessed to all the robberies, including both quick-stop incidents. Michael's hands shook slightly as he poured more coffee. So it's really over? The criminal case? Yes. Sarah hesitated. But if you want, we could file a civil suit against the police department, the DA's office, for wrongful arrest, malicious prosecution dash. Money won't give my grandson back those 3 weeks, Dorothy interrupted. Won't take away the fear, the shame, the people who turn their backs on us. No, Sarah agreed. But it might help change the system. Might make them think twice next time. Dorothy looked at Michael. Saw him thinking about other young men in orange jumpsuits. Other families torn apart by rushed judgments and convenient suspects. We'll think about it, he said. The afternoon brought more visitors. Mrs. Jenkins with a casserole and tears. Delivery customers who'd seen Michael's story on the news, coming to welcome him back. Even James Martinez from Quick Stop, stammering apologies. I should have told the truth from the start, he said, unable to meet their eyes. Should have stood up to the police. Dorothy saw Michael's jaw clench. Saw him struggle with anger, with forgiveness. You made it right in the end, he said finally. That's what matters. By evening, the reporters had gone. The visitors had left. Dorothy sat in her kitchen, watching Michael sort through 3 weeks of missed mail. Bill, he muttered. Gonna take some overtime to catch up? We'll manage, Dorothy said. We always do. But managing wasn't enough anymore. Not after everything they'd been through. The next morning, Dorothy put on her church dress. Not for church. Not yet, but for another kind of service. Where are you going? Michael asked, looking up from his delivery app. To tell our story, she said. Want to come with me? They drove with Sarah to a community center across town. Inside, families waited. Mothers, grandmothers, children. All with similar stories. All seeking help. Dorothy stood before them, Michael beside her. Told them about faith tested and restored. About justice sleeping and awakening. About truth buried but finally revealed. The system isn't perfect, she said, but it can be made better. If we stand together. If we speak up. If we don't let them make us kneel. Afterward, a young woman approached them. Eyes red from crying. They took my son last week. Said he matched the description. Dorothy took her hands, felt the trembling, the fear, the desperate hope. "Give me his name," Sarah said, already pulling out her files. "We'll look into it." That night, back home, Michael found Dorothy at the kitchen table, reading her Bible. "You didn't have to do that today," he said softly. "Didn't have to take on someone else's fight." Dorothy looked up at her grandson, saw the man he was becoming, stronger for being broken, wiser for seeing truth and lies. "Yes," she said, "I did. Because someone has to stand up. Someone has to speak out. Someone has to turn their pain into purpose." The next few weeks brought changes. Michael's story spread. Other cases came to light. The police department announced reviews of arrest procedures. The DA's office faced an investigation. Dorothy and Michael told their story again and again. To community groups, to church congregations, to anyone who would listen. Some days were harder than others. Michael still had nightmares about the jail. Dorothy still felt her chest tighten when police cars passed. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. But they weren't alone anymore. Sarah brought more cases, more families needing help. Jennifer Chen's reporting exposed more flaws in the system. The community that had once turned away now turned toward justice. One Sunday morning, a month after Michael's release, Dorothy put on her church dress again. Not for their old church. They'd found a new one, where the pastor preached about justice as much as mercy. Michael drove them in a borrowed car, the delivery app quiet for one day. "You know," he said, parking outside the small church, "when I was in jail, I was so angry. At everyone. Even God." Dorothy touched his hand. "And now?" He looked at her, his eyes clear and steady. "Now I understand. Sometimes God's work needs human hands. Sometimes faith means standing up, not just kneeling down." Inside the church, the congregation welcomed them. Not as victims, not as symbols, but as survivors, as witnesses, as voices for those still trapped in the system's shadow. Dorothy Williams sat in her new church, her grandson beside her, and felt something settle in her soul. Not peace. There was still too much work to do for peace. Not forgiveness. Some wounds would take longer to heal. But purpose. Clear and strong as morning light. Their story wasn't over. The fight for justice wasn't finished. But they were ready now. Ready to stand. Ready to speak. Ready to turn their trial into testimony. The choir began to sing. Dorothy reached for her grandson's hand. And for the first time since that morning the police came, she felt truly, completely free. Not just from fear, not just from injustice, but free to fight on, free to speak out, free to turn their pain into power. Because sometimes, she had learned, freedom isn't just what you're released from. It's what you're released to do. And Dorothy Williams had work to do. They all did. The work of justice, of truth, of change. One story at a time, one voice at a time, one victory at a time, until the system's shadow gave way to morning light, until faith and justice walked hand in hand, until every grandmother could sleep without fear for her grandson, until every Michael could walk free.